Helen had always lived quietly, not modestly in the sense of poverty, but quietly in spirit. She was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays without needing reminders, who knew exactly how her husband liked his coffee, and who had folded the same blue towels for 30 years without ever asking for help. At 61, she had graying hair that she refused to dye, warm hazel eyes, and hands that had prepared thousands of dinners without once hearing a proper thank you. Her husband Robert was a respected man in town, ran an engineering firm that bore his name, and always wore a tie even on Sundays. They had been married since their mid-20s, and to anyone looking from the outside, they were stable, maybe even admirable. But on a Wednesday morning in October, that illusion shattered like cheap porcelain. She was making his lunch, something she had done every weekday for decades, when he walked in holding his phone in one hand and a suitcase in the other. No warning, no argument. Just the heavy finality of a man who had already made a decision. "I'm leaving," he said, not looking at her. "There's someone else. Her name is Tessa. She's 38. We're moving to Austin." Helen didn't answer at first. She just stared at the peanut butter she'd been spreading on bread, her hand frozen mid-motion. He kept talking, something about how he didn't want to hurt her, how he'd make sure she kept the house, how he hoped the boys would understand. She said nothing, not when he left the kitchen, not when the door clicked shut behind him, not even when the silence settled over the house like dust. The next morning, she found herself sitting in her robe at the kitchen table, staring at the same spot on the wall for over an hour. Her phone lit up with a message from her son, Jason. "Dad told us." "You okay?" She didn't reply. She didn't know what okay even meant anymore. 3 days passed. 4. No more calls, no visits, just quiet. The house, once filled with footsteps and voices, now echoed. She walked past the empty side of the bed each night like it was a stranger's room. But then, on the 5th day, something changed. She went into the attic. Not for any real reason, maybe to distract herself, maybe to find old photo albums. But what she found instead was a dusty cardboard box marked Patents and Designs, 1991 to 2002. She opened it slowly. Inside were folders. Dozens of them. Technical drawings, documents, prototypes. Some had her handwriting on the edges. She remembered now. Those nights she sat beside Robert, helping him refine language for applications, fixing formatting, sketching ideas when he was too tired to see straight. "Let's register this under my name for now," he had said once. "It's just simpler for the company structure." She had nodded, trusting him, and then forgotten. But here it all was, proof that she had helped create 3 of his most profitable patents, the very ones that had launched his business into the 7-figure bracket 15 years ago. Her name wasn't listed on any official document, but her handwriting was there, her notes, her signature in margins. Her mind began to shift. Grief turned to focus. She scanned the pages one by one, took pictures with her phone, and began a folder labeled, "Just in case." That night, she called a lawyer. A calm woman named Clarissa picked up. Helen said only this: "I think my husband built his fortune using me. I think I have proof." Clarissa paused and then replied, "Come in tomorrow morning. Bring everything." Helen hung up and looked around her home. She saw it differently now, not as a place of abandonment, but as a battlefield. And she wasn't done fighting. The final straw came when she received a letter in the mail the next day. From Robert's lawyer. A polite, condescending letter outlining a proposed divorce settlement. It offered her the house and a small monthly stipend. In return, she had to waive all claims to the business. It was signed, sealed, and dated October 6th, 2 weeks before he left. So, he had planned this. Down to the day. Her hands trembled, but she didn't cry. She walked to the fireplace, threw the letter in, and watched it burn. Then she whispered, more to herself than anyone, They always think we'll just fold. They forget who held the pieces together in the first place. And with that, Helen took her phone, opened her camera roll filled with patent photos, and sent them all to Clarissa with a single caption. Let's begin. The law office smelled like lemons and expensive silence. Helen sat across from Clarissa, a poised woman in her 40s with sharp cheekbones and eyes that missed nothing. Clarissa didn't waste time on pleasantries. She reviewed every scanned image, flipping through them with a lawyer's cold precision. "These aren't nothing," she finally said. "They won't win you half the business, but they might get us leverage, especially if we can prove you contributed without compensation." Helen's lips barely moved. "I wasn't trying to be compensated back then. I just helped." Clarissa nodded once, slowly. "And now?" Helen looked up. "Now I want him to know he can't erase me like I was a secretary." That was the beginning. Over the next week, Clarissa filed a motion for temporary injunction, preventing Robert from selling or restructuring any of the business assets until full discovery. When he received the court papers, he called her. For the first time since he'd walked out. "What the hell are you doing, Helen?" he barked. "You think this is smart? You're embarrassing yourself." Her voice was quiet. "You already did that for me?" He laughed, a sharp, joyless sound. "Is this about money? Fine. You want more? I'll give you more. But dragging this into court is pathetic." "No," she said simply. "What's pathetic is pretending 30 years of my work meant nothing." He hung up. 2 days later, her younger son, Michael, showed up at the door unannounced. He looked uncomfortable, holding a Starbucks cup like it was a shield. "Dad says you're suing him," he said after sitting down. Helen studied her son's face. He had Robert's chin, Robert's posture, but his eyes were his own, softer, less sure. "I'm not suing your father," she said carefully. "I'm making sure I get what I helped build." Michael shifted. "He's angry, says you're overreacting, that you were just a housewife." The word landed like a slap. Helen didn't flinch. "A housewife who drew diagrams, wrote patent language, helped him write the pitch that landed him his first investor?" Michael stared at the floor. "I didn't know that." "Of course you didn't," she said, not unkindly. "Because he never wanted anyone to know." Michael left without hugging her, but he didn't look back with disgust either. That night, Helen opened an old email folder from the early 2000s. Inside were messages from Robert asking her to edit proposals, scan blueprints, calculate margins. She began forwarding them to Clarissa one by one. Each subject line was another nail in the coffin of his version of events. "Just proofread this for clarity? Can you draw the schematic again? Investor meeting notes. Don't forget to attach the timeline you made." The lawyer responded the next morning. "These are excellent. Keep digging. This is turning into something real." Helen didn't feel triumphant, not yet, but she felt present, awake, like the fog that had dulled her senses since Robert's departure was beginning to lift. On Friday, a courier arrived at her house. Inside the envelope was a formal invitation to Robert's company anniversary gala, a gold-embossed card. Polite wording. "You are cordially invited to celebrate 25 years of Arlo Engineering." Helen stared at the date. It was set for 3 weeks from now. The gall. She knew why it was sent. Tessa, his new girlfriend, would be there, probably introduced to clients as the reason Robert found new inspiration. Helen sat in silence for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and texted Clarissa. "Can I attend that gala as your guest?" Clarissa replied in under a minute. "Absolutely. But I suggest you don't go quietly." Helen smiled, the first real smile in weeks. In the following days, she dug deeper. She didn't just want her share, she wanted her story heard. She found a retired engineer Robert used to work with, a kind man named Leonard, who now lived in Arizona. She called him out of the blue. He remembered her instantly. Helen? You're the one who figured out the heat transfer formula. Bob always said it was his, but I remember him cursing about it until you solved the math. Her hands shook as she thanked him. Would you be willing to write a statement? You still baking those apple pies? He joked. Write me a mailing address. I'll send you one better. A notarized letter. That night, Helen watched her own reflection in the mirror. She didn't see a victim. She saw a woman who had survived a quiet erasure and was writing herself back into the record. And when she tried on her old navy blue dress, the one she hadn't worn in a decade, she didn't care that her arms were softer or her waist not what it used to be. All she saw was purpose. And purpose looked damn good in navy. The night of the gala arrived with cold rain and silver wind. Helen stood outside the venue in a long, dark coat, her hair pinned up, the navy blue dress underneath hidden for now. Clarissa met her by the steps, dressed in tailored black, holding a slim clutch and an air of confidence that could slice steel. You don't have to say anything tonight, she murmured. Just be seen, but if you do speak, make it count. Helen nodded once. Inside, the hall glowed with warm chandeliers and moneyed laughter. Robert's firm had spared no expense. White roses in crystal vases, waiters in tuxedos. Champagne flowing like apologies no one meant. Helen walked in with Clarissa, slow, deliberate steps. Conversations dipped. A few old colleagues did double takes. Robert stood near the stage, one hand resting on the back of a slim blonde in a red dress. Tessa. She had the kind of smile that stretched too wide, like someone trying to claim a throne they hadn't earned. Robert turned, caught sight of Helen, and his mouth froze mid-word. He wasn't expecting her. Not like this. Not radiant. Not composed. For a moment, he looked like a man who saw a ghost and realized the ghost had teeth. Helen didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just walked past him, letting her heels click on the marble like tiny declarations of war. At their table, Clarissa handed her a glass of water. Half the board is here tonight, and investors. Helen nodded. Good. An hour in, Robert took the stage. He spoke of legacy, of perseverance, of the journey. Not once did he mention her, not even vaguely. He thanked clients, mentors, even his new partner. Who has brought me fresh perspective and reminded me what passion looks like? Helen didn't blink, but Clarissa leaned in and whispered, He's burying himself. This is gold. The speech ended to polite applause. Robert stepped down, and almost immediately a man in his 60s approached Helen. Mrs. Arlo, I remember you. You and Robert used to come to the conferences in Boston. You presented the prototype model back in '99, didn't you? Helen's voice was gentle. I did, but he filed the patent alone. The man frowned. I always wondered about that. He patted her arm. It's good to see you here, really good. Word spread. Small conversations began to form. Whispers. Is that his ex-wife? I thought she helped with the early projects. Wasn't she the one who fixed the coolant issue on the third-gen design? By dessert, Helen had been approached 4 times by former colleagues. Some apologized, some just looked guilty. But one woman, an older secretary named Diane, quietly slipped Helen a folded paper. I don't know if this helps, but I found this in an old folder before I retired. It's a memo. Your name is all over it. Helen squeezed her hand. Thank you. Back home that night, she scanned the memo and forwarded it to Clarissa. The subject line read, Let's tighten the noose. A week later, Robert's tone shifted. He called again, this time calm, almost pleading. Helen, what are you doing? She sat in her kitchen, the same one where he left her, sipping tea. You know what I'm doing. This is going to cost both of us, he said. And I'm trying to be decent here. Tessa thinks we should just pay you off. Helen laughed quietly. Tessa thinks? Well, that's generous of her. He sighed. Look, I'll give you the house. And a lump sum. 200,000? That's fair. Helen's voice was steady. Robert, you made $8 million off the designs we built together. I'm not asking for favors. I'm demanding recognition. Silence, then a click. He hung up. 2 days later, Helen's son Jason called. Mom, Dad's freaking out. He's talking about canceling the expansion deal with Daxton Corp because you might claim intellectual co-ownership. Is that true? Helen didn't lie. It's possible. Jason hesitated. I didn't know you were part of all that. I thought you were just at home. I was, she said. And while I was at home, I saved your father from 2 failed product launches, 3 investor walkouts, and a lawsuit. Jason went quiet. Do you need help with anything? Like support? Helen's voice softened. Not right now, but thank you for asking. That night, she opened a notebook and began to write. Not legal strategy, memories, the real history. She wrote about late nights and cold pizza and drafting technical specs on napkins, about being told she was just helping when she knew she was co-creating, and she wrote a line that stayed with her for days. Women like me build empires, quietly. And then we get told we were never there. She closed the notebook and stared out the window. A storm was rolling in, dark clouds coiling over the town like secrets that finally wanted to be heard. Helen didn't feel fear. She felt ready. 2 weeks later, Helen walked into the mediation room with her back straight and her chin slightly raised. Robert was already seated at the table, dressed in an expensive navy suit, his hair recently trimmed, a gold watch peeking from beneath his cuff. Tessa sat beside him, lips pursed, flipping through a glossy folder like she had a stake in the war. Clarissa joined Helen with a tablet and a calm smile. Don't speak unless I cue you. He'll try to provoke you. Let him, she whispered. Helen nodded. The mediator, a tired man in his 50s, began the session by reading a standard introduction about fairness and resolution. Robert cut in before he finished. Let's be honest, he said, looking only at Clarissa. This is about ego. Helen wants to rewrite history because she can't stand the fact that I moved on. Clarissa replied evenly. We're here because your company was built using intellectual input from a person you excluded, both legally and financially. Tessa scoffed. She made sandwiches and typed up notes. That's not co-ownership. Helen didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and slid a stack of printed emails onto the table. Typed up notes, she repeated, her voice calm. Like this one, where I restructured the proposal before you submitted it to Parnell Systems? Or this, where I corrected the algorithm in your thermal load draft? Or maybe this one, where you thanked me for fixing the efficiency model your engineers couldn't crack? Tessa's smile faltered. Robert shifted in his chair. Clarissa tapped the table lightly. We're prepared to call 3 former employees who witnessed Mrs. Arlo's contributions firsthand. One of them has already provided a sworn statement. You might remember Leonard Price? Robert's face changed. Helen could see it, the flicker of real fear. He hadn't expected her to go that far. He had underestimated her resolve, the depth of her memory, and the quiet precision with which she could dismantle his version of the truth. The mediator looked at Robert. Given the documentation presented, I would advise you to consider a private settlement before this goes to court. Public records won't be kind to reputations. Robert muttered something under his breath, then spoke louder. What do you want, Helen? She looked at him steadily. I want my name acknowledged. I want an official letter signed by you and the board, recognizing my contributions. I want compensation proportionate to the revenue from the 3 patented designs I helped develop. And I want the revised company history to include me where I belonged all along. Tessa opened her mouth, but Robert raised his hand. You're not on the board, he snapped. Then he turned back to Helen. You'll destroy the firm's reputation. Helen didn't blink. I didn't destroy anything. You did when you pretended I was invisible. The mediation paused for lunch. Outside, Clarissa leaned against the wall with Helen. He's cracking. He's not angry anymore. He's panicking. Helen sipped her coffee slowly. Good. That night, back home, she received a message from Michael. It was a picture. Her grandson drawing at the kitchen table. Underneath it, a caption. He asked when Grandma was coming back. I didn't know what to say. Her fingers hovered over the phone. She typed, "Tell him soon." And for the first time in months, she meant it. Not because she was giving in, but because she was taking back everything on her own terms. The following week, Clarissa called. They offered a new proposal, high six figures, formal recognition, inclusion in the revised website and future materials, but only if you sign an NDA about the past. Helen was silent for a long time. Then she said, "No NDA. If I've learned anything, it's that silence is where they bury us." Clarissa smiled on the other end. "That's what I hoped you'd say." The next day, the final meeting was scheduled. Helen wore a deep emerald blouse and minimal makeup. She didn't come to gloat. She came to close a chapter. Robert didn't look her in the eye as the papers were signed. Tessa stayed silent, tapping her acrylic nails against the table. When it was done, Clarissa shook Helen's hand and said, "You rewrote history, and you did it with grace." Outside, the air smelled like spring, even though it was barely March. Helen walked slowly to her car, feeling the weight that had settled on her shoulders for decades finally begin to lift. That night, she opened her notebook again. She crossed out the sentence she had written before and replaced it with a new one. "They almost erased me, but I turned the page myself." And on the last line, she added, "This isn't revenge. This is correction." The news spread faster than Helen expected. Within a week of the settlement, a quiet article appeared in a local business magazine. Behind the patent, the woman who helped build Arlo Engineering. It wasn't flashy, just a few paragraphs, a small photo of her taken at the gala, but it said the one thing she'd waited years to hear. Her name, printed beside the words co-creator and technical contributor. Helen read it alone at her kitchen table, a cup of black coffee cooling beside her hand. She didn't cry. She just stared at it for a long time, her fingers tracing the edge of the page like it might vanish if she looked away. Later that day, her doorbell rang. It was Michael, with her grandson in tow. The boy ran to her without hesitation, wrapping his arms around her legs. "Grandma, Daddy said you made robot stuff." She laughed softly, crouching down to hug him. Not quite robots, but close enough. Michael stood awkwardly nearby, holding a small plant in a white ceramic pot. "It's rosemary," he said. "You used to grow it by the kitchen window. I thought maybe—" Helen took it gently. "Thank you." They didn't say everything that needed to be said. But something shifted in that moment. A beginning, not an apology. That evening, she placed the rosemary in its old spot. The light hit it just right, like it remembered where it belonged. Calls started coming. A podcast for women in STEM asked her to be a guest. A retired teacher invited her to speak at a local college. Each time she answered with a polite, hesitant, yes. She wasn't chasing recognition. She was reclaiming the pieces of herself that had been scattered across decades of quiet sacrifice. Then, out of nowhere, Jason called. His voice was lower than usual. "I read the article," he said. "You know, growing up, I always thought you were just there, present but background. And now I feel stupid for not seeing what you were really doing all that time." Helen didn't respond immediately. Then she said, "Mothers are usually in the background, until they're not." Jason sighed. "Can we have dinner? Just us?" She agreed. They met at a small Italian restaurant she used to love. He looked older than she remembered, like the guilt had carved lines into his forehead. "I was angry at you," he said over soup. "Not because of what you did, but because you reminded me how blind we'd been. Dad made it so easy to believe he did it all on his own." Helen stirred her spoon slowly. "He needed to believe that, but you didn't have to." Jason reached across the table, covering her hand. I'm sorry, Mom. Truly. For the first time, the apology didn't feel like a performance. It felt earned. Later that night, back home, Helen opened the drawer where she had once kept birthday cards, old receipts, and Robert's notes. She cleared it out. Made space. A few days later, a letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. Inside was a single sheet. You didn't just help me build a company. You built me. And I walked away like none of it mattered. I'll never deserve your forgiveness. But I needed you to know that I know. R. She folded the letter and placed it in a box marked closure. Then she locked it and put the key in a jar she rarely touched. Not because she hated him, but because he no longer mattered in the way he used to. On Sunday morning, she walked into the local community center. A group of women sat in a circle, waiting. Some in their 40s, others in their 60s. A volunteer introduced her as a woman with experience in being forgotten and fighting her way back. Helen smiled. I used to believe being quiet made me good, she said. Now I know being quiet just made me easy to ignore. The women leaned in. One took notes, another wiped away a tear. Helen didn't think of herself as a teacher. But she knew something they didn't yet know, what came after the breaking. And she was ready to tell it. A month after the settlement, Helen received an invitation in the mail, this time not from Robert's circle, but from a local foundation honoring women innovators in business and technology. They wanted to recognize her during their annual banquet, citing her pioneering role in early design work and unwavering pursuit of justice. She reread the letter 3 times before setting it down on the kitchen table. No one had ever used the word pioneering in reference to her. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, remembering the years she spent sitting silently in the back of conference halls while Robert took the microphone. Remembering how she clapped the loudest when his name was called. Now, someone was clapping for her. She called Clarissa the next morning. Should I go? Clarissa didn't hesitate. You should own the room. 2 days later, Helen stood in front of her closet and stared at her reflection. Not for vanity. For truth. She no longer needed to prove anything, but she wanted to mark this moment. She chose a deep burgundy dress, soft velvet, simple cut. She pinned her silver hair up and wore earrings her mother once gave her. Delicate, with blue stones that caught the light when she moved. At the event, people greeted her like they already knew her story. Some had read the article. Others had seen the podcast. A few simply said, I heard what you did. You inspire me. Helen felt the weight of their eyes not as pressure, but as recognition. When she took the stage to accept her award, her voice didn't tremble. For years, she said, I told myself that loyalty meant silence. That if I just waited long enough, someone would notice the work I did. But silence isn't loyalty. It's erasure. And today, I'm here to say, no more. The audience rose. Applause echoed like thunder. After the ceremony, a woman approached her. Mid-30s, professional, confident. My boss once took credit for a software I developed. I stayed quiet. You've made me reconsider that decision. Helen offered a quiet smile. It's never too late to rewrite your name into the story. That night, she returned home to find another letter on her doorstep. No envelope. Just a folded piece of paper tucked under a rock. It was from Tessa. I thought I was winning, it said. But now I see I was just a chapter in a much bigger book I never bothered to read. He talks about you all the time. Not fondly, but with fear. That must mean something. Helen folded the paper carefully and threw it into the fireplace. Not out of spite. Out of finality. She had no interest in Tessa's guilt or Robert's fear. She was done living in other people's margins. The following week, she returned to the community center. A new woman had joined the circle, widowed, 56, quiet. When she spoke, her voice cracked. My husband left everything in his sister's name. I didn't find out until after the funeral. Helen leaned forward, her tone calm but strong. You still have your story. It's not too late to make them hear it. Slowly, the woman nodded. After the session, Helen walked to the local cafe. She sat by the window with a notebook and scribbled down ideas. Not memories this time. Plans. She was thinking of launching a mentorship group. Something for women her age and older. Those who had been sidelined, silenced, rewritten. It wouldn't be formal at first. Just a gathering. A name flickered in her mind. The Unforgotten. She underlined it twice. A week later, she printed flyers. By the end of the month, 8 women had joined. They met every Sunday in the library's side room. They drank tea. They told the truth. One by one, their stories came loose, like buttons finally unfastened from tight old coats. Helen didn't try to lead them. She let the silence stretch when it needed to. But when she did speak, they listened. Because she had lived it. Not just the betrayal, but the long, aching climb back to herself. And now, she was teaching them how to climb too. The library room grew fuller each week. By mid-April, there were over a dozen women gathered in mismatched chairs around Helen. Some had graying roots and tired eyes. Others wore bright scarves or held hands as they spoke. The air smelled of jasmine tea and quiet courage. They called themselves the Unforgotten now. Not as victims, but as a reminder to each other that they had stories worth telling, worth defending. Helen brought in small slips of paper and asked each woman to write down one thing that had been taken from them. A name, a right, a dream, and fold it into a jar. No one read them aloud. But when the jar was full, they placed it in the center of the table like a soft monument to what they had survived. One Sunday afternoon, as rain tapped the windows, Helen was approached by a local journalist. He asked to sit in on a meeting. She declined. This wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about healing. But she agreed to a private interview. A week later, a piece ran under the title, Not a Comeback. A continuation. The photo showed Helen outside the library, arms crossed, smiling just slightly, as if daring the world to question what she had reclaimed. On the same day the article published, she received an email from Daxton Corporation. The company Robert once nearly partnered with. A woman named Mariah, head of development, had read the story. We're exploring a mentorship project, it read, focused on overlooked female innovators. I'd love your insight, or involvement. Helen stared at the message for a long time before typing, I'm interested. Let's talk. She didn't tell her sons right away. But one evening at Jason's house, while helping her grandson with a school project, he asked, Grandma, are you famous now? She laughed softly. Not famous, just remembered. Jason looked at her for a beat longer. You look lighter. She nodded. I feel that way too. Michael called later that week, asking if she'd speak at his office's Women's History Month event. We never had someone like you, he admitted. And after everything, well, maybe it's time people heard from someone real. Helen said yes. The event was in a large auditorium, bright lights, rows of polished professionals. She spoke without notes, told her story without bitterness, only clarity. I spent years thinking I was supporting a great man, and maybe I was. But I forgot to ask if he was helping build me too. I forgot to ask if I mattered outside the shadows. Now I know I did. The applause wasn't loud, but it was long. That night, she returned home and found an envelope taped to her front door. Her name was handwritten across the front. No return address. Inside was a photo. She hadn't seen it in decades. It showed her and Robert in their 30s standing in front of the first office of Arlo Engineering. She was holding the blueprint. He had his arm around her, but she was the one smiling. On the back, someone had written, History doesn't lie. Only people do. She recognized the handwriting. Diane, the old secretary. Helen sat on the couch and stared at the image, Then she picked up her phone, took a picture of it, and uploaded it to the Unforgotten's new online forum. Underneath, she typed, "Proof comes in many forms. Sometimes it takes years, but it always finds you." The replies flooded in. Heart emojis, stories, thank yous. Someone commented, "We needed you. All of us. We just didn't know how to find each other." And Helen realized something she hadn't seen coming. Not only had she rebuilt herself, she had become the foundation for others. She had become what Robert never was, a legacy worth following. By early summer, Helen's days were no longer marked by silence. Mornings began with emails from women across the country, some young, some older, all carrying pieces of her story in their own. She answered each one, not with advice, but with presence. Afternoons were spent planning sessions for the Unforgotten, now preparing to expand into other cities. Evenings brought quiet walks, the kind she used to take with Robert, but now alone, and somehow more peaceful. She walked not to remember, but to breathe. One Sunday morning, a letter arrived from a law firm in Austin. It was curt, stamped, formal. Robert had passed away. Stroke. Sudden. The letter informed her of pending final arrangements and included a note from the executor. "You remain listed in the original will, never updated after divorce. There are items in a personal safety deposit box under your name." Helen sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't feel relief either. Just stillness. A week later, she traveled to Austin, walked into the bank, presented her ID, and was escorted to a private room. The box was placed before her. She opened it slowly. Inside were three things. First, a leather-bound notebook. His handwriting filled every page, notes about the company, reflections, sketches. She flipped to a marked section. It was dated 2 years before he left. "Helen sees patterns I miss. She finds flaws in logic I thought flawless. I never told her. I should have. I hope she forgives me for pretending she was just background." She closed the book. Next was a small velvet pouch. Inside was the pendant she had once sold to help fund their first prototype. She hadn't seen it in decades. Finally, there was a flash drive. It contained a video file. She hesitated, then plugged it into her laptop. Robert appeared on screen, older, weary. "If you're watching this, then I'm probably gone. I never planned to apologize this way. But maybe it's the only way I can tell the truth without trying to defend myself. You were the backbone. You were the reason I didn't drown when everything felt too big. And I left you. Not because you failed me, but because you saw too much. Because you reminded me of the parts of myself I didn't want to face. I hope the world finally sees what I refuse to admit, and I hope you do too." Helen watched without blinking. When the video ended, she didn't replay it. She didn't need to. Some truths don't need echoing. That evening, she called her sons. She told them about the will, the notebook, the video. Jason was quiet. Michael asked if she was okay. "I'm fine," she said. "I think I've been fine for a while now." She donated the pendant to a women's archive project. Sent the notebook to Clarissa, who had it scanned and stored with the rest of the legal documentation. The flash drive she kept, for reasons she couldn't explain. Maybe to remember that even the ones who hurt us most can sometimes still carry pieces of our voice. Weeks passed. The Unforgotten held its first retreat. 30 women gathered at a lakeside lodge, sharing meals, building projects, starting books, writing speeches. Helen walked among them not as a leader, but as proof. At the closing circle, one woman stood up and said, "They told us we were too late, too old, too invisible, but they were wrong. We were just waiting to become unstoppable." Helen didn't add anything. She just smiled. That night, as the women sat by the fire, someone pulled out a guitar and began to sing. The melody was low, steady, familiar. Helen sat with her knees drawn up, a blanket around her shoulders, and let the music carry her somewhere soft, somewhere earned. And as she looked up at the stars, she whispered only to herself, I wasn't done. I never was. Late August brought with it a humid stillness, the kind that made the air feel heavy, even when the sky was clear. Helen stood at the edge of the small garden behind her home, clipping back the dried lavender she had planted earlier that spring. The rosemary from Michael's still thrived on the windowsill, a little wild, but full of scent. A letter had arrived that morning. Official, gold-trimmed. It was from the city council. They wanted to recognize her work with the Unforgotten at their fall ceremony honoring community leaders. She stared at the embossed lettering and felt nothing like pride. What she felt was clarity. It wasn't about awards. It never had been. That same afternoon, she received a voicemail from Diane. Her voice was slower now, a little raspier. Helen, I just thought you should know. Tessa sold the lake house, the one you and Robert bought years ago. Said she couldn't keep it. Too many ghosts, she said. Helen didn't call back. She didn't need to. That house hadn't felt like hers in years. But later that night, she pulled out an old photo album. The lake house, summers with the boys, her dog asleep on the dock, Robert grinning in sunglasses, holding her hand. She stared at the images with something between grief and gratitude. She didn't rip the photos. She didn't throw them away. She closed the book and placed it gently on the shelf. The next day, she met with Mariah from Daxton Corporation in person. They spoke over coffee for 2 hours. The company wanted to fund a full mentorship program nationwide. They wanted Helen to design it, not just advise. Lead. She hesitated. I'm not a corporate person, she said. Mariah leaned forward. You're not. That's why we need you. By the end of the week, she had accepted. The program would launch in January. It would be called the Unforgotten Initiative. That evening, Helen sat on her porch watching the sunset melt into amber and rose. Jason arrived unannounced with his son. He wanted to show you his science project, he said. The boy pulled out a poster board, messily glued pictures and facts about inventors. Helen smiled when she saw her own photo taped in the corner. I told my teacher you made machines too, he said proudly. Helen's throat tightened. She nodded, steady. That's right. I did. Jason stayed a little longer that night. They didn't talk about the past. But when he hugged her before leaving, he held on just a second longer than usual. As autumn crept in, the Unforgotten flourished. A second city. Then a third. Women who hadn't spoken in years found their voices. Some started businesses, others filed lawsuits. A few simply stopped apologizing, and always they credited her. But Helen deflected the praise. I just started the fire, she would say. You all kept it burning. One rainy Saturday, she received a package in the mail. No name, no note, just a book, leather-bound, rich and dark. Inside were transcriptions of every public speech she'd ever made in the last year. On the title page, someone had engraved, "She didn't shout, but we heard her anyway." Helen pressed the book to her chest and closed her eyes. It was never about revenge. It was about presence. The kind that doesn't fade. The kind that lingers long after people forget your birthday or your name. That evening, she attended a quiet dinner hosted by Clarissa. A thank you of sorts. As they cleared dishes, Clarissa asked, "Do you ever wish you had done it sooner?" Helen thought for a long moment. I think I had to be broken in just the right way to understand how to put myself back together. Clarissa raised a glass. To all the versions of you, and to the one who refused to stay invisible. They drank. The moment was soft. No fireworks. Just peace. And as Helen walked home beneath the streetlights, a light mist in the air, she whispered, "One more chapter." Winter came without warning. One morning, the leaves were gold, and by the next week, frost had drawn delicate veins across Helen's windows. She didn't mind the cold. It brought a silence that no longer felt like abandonment. She had learned to fill her own rooms, not with noise, but with meaning. The Unforgotten Initiative launched officially in January. The ceremony was small, intentional. No flash. Just a circle of women seated beside a fire pit, bundled in coats, holding warm mugs, their eyes full of something deep and earned. Helen didn't give a speech that day. Instead, she lit the first candle and passed the flame along the circle. When it reached the final hand, someone said softly, "This is what legacy looks like." At home that evening, she took out her old notebook and opened to the last blank page. She wrote, "He left me to chase youth. I chose to chase truth. He thought I would fade. I decided to rise." She closed the book gently, placed it in the top drawer of her desk, and locked it, not to hide it, but to say it was finished. Her sons called often now. Jason came by most Sundays with his boy, who never left without a kiss on the cheek. Michael invited her to speak at his firm's international conference. She declined, not out of fear, but because she had nothing more to prove. Some evenings she walked past her reflection and barely recognized the woman she had become. Not because of how she looked, but because of how little space the pain now took inside her. One late February afternoon, she received a letter from a young woman in Nebraska. 26. Recently divorced. Undervalued. "I heard you speak," the letter read. "And for the first time, I believed I could still start again. Thank you for being the voice I didn't know I needed." Helen read it twice. Then she folded it, tied it with a ribbon, and placed it in a small wooden box labeled "Letters That Matter." The box wasn't full yet, but it was growing. A week later, Helen visited the beach house. Not the old one. That chapter was closed. She had found a small cottage near the coast, humble but full of light. The ocean was close enough to hear at night. She brought with her only what mattered: a tea kettle, the rosemary plant, the notebook. She sat on the porch, blanket over her lap, listening to the waves crash like memory meeting shore. In the quiet, she smiled. No one knew she was there, and that, for once, felt like a gift. Not because she was forgotten, but because she was finally whole. As the sun dipped low and painted the sky with lavender and ash, Helen whispered into the wind, "I was never just his wife. I was never just the woman who stayed. I was the one who watched, remembered, and rebuilt, and I was never done." The tide rolled in, steady, certain, and somewhere far beyond the horizon, the old world faded, and a new one, hers alone, began.